There you go. Take it away.
All right, thank you for having me back. I'm going to share my slides. One moment. And I suppose if you're not muted, you should be muted.
Okay.
And we'll do Q&A afterwards. I hope you can see this okay. Okay, so here we are with our part 2 of Jewish Los Angeles. I was thinking of different ways of approaching this. We could look at the kind of meta view of institutional development, population development, look at the development of various Jewish neighborhoods and such. But that gets kind of complicated. And part of the reason why the time frame is fairly limited here, 1900 to 1920, is that there's just so much going on in terms of these developments that I thought it would be a little better to just focus on certain smaller stories that are maybe emblematic of larger trends that are going on during this time. So, with that in mind, I just want to remind you that you'll have access to many more of these stories from Los Angeles and elsewhere in the American West at our website, museum, jmaw.org. That's the Jewish Museum of the American West, where we have over 600 exhibits, mostly biographical, several focusing on institutions as well. But this is west of the Mississippi and into parts of Canada, Mexico, the Pacific Rim, etc. The other highlight, I think, of note and certainly of relevance is the book, Jewish Los Angeles, which we put together a couple years ago, came out in 2020, which is a collection of around 200 photographs with rich captions addressing the history of Jews in Los Angeles from the 1840s until the 1950s. So this includes photographs from our archives. We have about 4,000 historical photographs, many of which are of Los Angeles. So, if you have the book, if you read the book, I'm sure you'll note that it's not comprehensive. How can it be? It's a small book, but it's a picture book as well. So we were limited to using photographs that were in our archives. But I think, again, it will give you a much deeper context and history than we can do in a short time that we have today. And certainly, we're just looking at a smaller chunk of time, 1900 to 1920. This is part 2. Maybe there will be part 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. We'll see. But that's up to you for sure. The other thing of note is that our journal, Western States Jewish History, was relaunched recently. We're on issue 2 of the revived journal now. That just came out, I think, last month, volume 51. If you're familiar with the Western States Jewish History Association, the journal had been in print from 1968 to 2018. It went dormant for a few years, and we recently revived it as a peer-reviewed academic journal through Texas Tech University Press. I think it's distributed by Duke University Press. Anyway, it now is, more of an academic journal. But I think, if you are familiar with the journal as it used to be, it has the same kind of flavor, certainly the same focus, the same charm, I hope. We're trying to retain that as well. And also please the academic audience. So it's sort of trying to bridge those two worlds. And if you're interested in subscribing, you can check with me or go directly to Texas Tech University Press. Okay, so here's an overview of the period for today. Again, the very early decades of the 20th century. So if you recall, if you were with us last time, we reached, I think, up in, at the point of the turn of last century, talking about the B'nai B'rith Messenger, which was founded in 1897. So we're sort of going to pick it up from there. So as it says here, during the early decades of the 20th century, Los Angeles achieved its status as the southern metropolis. The northern metropolis, obviously, was San Francisco. And if you know anything about the rivalry between the two cities, in those early days in particular, San Francisco sort of looked down on LA, both figuratively and I suppose literally as well. Maybe denigrating certain aspects of the city. We'll see some of that today. Certainly thinking of itself, San Francisco, as the metropolis, and Los Angeles is kind of the backwaters, and there are historical reasons for that. But it was during this period that LA really came into its own as a city, and I think we could say, oh, getting some feedback.
That's me.
Please mute if you can. Thank you. Yes, so the Jewish community in Los Angeles really came into its own at this time as well. So in 1900, the population was 102,479 in Los Angeles, double what it had been 10 years earlier. And by 1920, the city had exploded to 576,673, according to the census records. But the Jewish population actually outpaced the larger trend, growing 16 times from 2,500 in 1900 to about 40,000 in 1920. And there were numerous factors that contributed to the city's rapid growth, and we could say the growth of the Jewish community, which included the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which sent migrants southward, the emergence of the Hollywood film industry, the immigration from Europe following World War I, and other factors. From a Jewish perspective, one of the interesting phenomena during this time was the Industrial Removal Office in New York sending 2,000 Eastern European Jews to Los Angeles. That was a project, and certainly other Eastern European Jews would come during this time as well. Some Jews became pioneers of the nascent movie business, as I'm sure you're all aware. Others started businesses to accommodate the city's growing customer base. The multi-ethnic Boyle Heights neighborhood attracted many Jewish residents. Certainly this was a time of restrictions and restricted neighborhoods. So the poorer, less desirable, quote unquote, populations would end up in neighborhoods such as Boyle Heights. The Temple Street and Central Avenue districts also became Jewish neighborhoods at this time. And the list of Jewish institutions grew to include the Casper Cone Hospital, which is today's Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Jewish Consumptive Relief Association, which is today's City of Hope National Medical Center, Hebrew Sheltering Home for the Aged, today's Jewish Home, the Jewish Orphans Home of Southern California, today's Vista Del Mar Child and Family Services, the National Council of Jewish Women, Young Zionist Association, and several others. So this, again, was a time of great Jewish population growth, and with that, the growth of institutions. So much so that the Federation of Jewish Charities was formed in 1912 to unite the fundraising efforts of these various organizations. So that's just the backdrop. So one of the things we addressed last time was the original Jewish site in Los Angeles, which was the cemetery at Chavez Ravine, founded in 1855. Well, as I mentioned, during the early decades of the 20th century, Los Angeles was growing, the Jewish population was growing, and really by the turn of the 20th century, the cemetery at Chavez Ravine was no longer able to serve the city's growing Jewish population. There were also eminent domain issues there, which would continue into even to the 1950s with the controversies and various developments around Dodger Stadium, etc. But for a number of reasons, the cemetery moved from that area, from Chavez Ravine, to the Home of Peace, which some of you probably are aware of, which is now at Whittier Boulevard. It used to be Stevenson Avenue in East Los Angeles. That cemetery was founded by Congregation B'nai B'rith, today's Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and the interred at the Chavez Ravine were actually moved to the Home of Peace between 1902 and 1910. And at the grounds of that cemetery was, at Home of Peace Cemetery, was this house. This was for the superintendent and his family. This is a picture from the very early days of the Home of Peace Cemetery, somewhere around 1910. This is another site, a low spot at the Home of Peace Cemetery, which was developed into a pond, as you can see, which collected excess water from the watered lawns. And as I mentioned, the grounds were maintained by Congregation B'nai B'rith, but there was a report from 1902 when the new cemetery, Home of Peace, was being developed that said, quote, "Plots will be sold to other Jewish societies, and provision has been made for the proper burial of indigent Jews as well." So swimming in the pond at a cemetery. This is one of the synagogues of the past, the Olive Street Shul. This was an Orthodox congregation founded in this synagogue was formed in 1902 from other kind of fledgling Orthodox groups in the city. As you're probably aware, the Eastern Orthodox or Eastern European Orthodox Jews didn't number in great numbers at this time. So this was kind of a consolidated congregation, technically called Beth Israel. It was on Olive Street, I think 227 Olive Street, if I'm remembering correctly, and served that community until about 1940. This is in the Bunker Hill area of Los Angeles, which in the 60s was developed. And I think the building was a casualty of that development. But it was notable for having a lay-led community for most of its existence. In fact, I did some significant research on cantors in Los Angeles, being a cantor myself. And there was great controversy in the early period when the congregation tried to hire a professional cantor who came with, accolades and pedigree and so forth. His name was Victor Rosenstein, probably the first hired cantor in Los Angeles, but he only lasted there for about 6 months because the community felt that they didn't need a professional cantor. They were also a little bit concerned about how well he came off in terms of the female population in the community. He was, written about in glowing ways, etc. And so there was a service at this congregation where Victor Rosenstein began to sing, and all of the board members and their cohorts left the sanctuary and went to the Bet Midrash to continue their service as sort of a statement. Anyway, it didn't go well. I could tell you that whole story at another time, but that's one Olive Street Shul story that I'm aware of. And this is a very interesting photograph because this is a wedding. You see the interior of the Olive Street Shul here. And according to the Los Angeles Times, and this was a photograph taken in 1909, this was, quote, the first known photograph to be taken of an Orthodox Jewish ceremony in a synagogue. I don't think that's true, and I don't know what their frame of reference is, or what if it was the first in Los Angeles or the first anywhere. Obviously, we could find contrary evidence. But it was rare to have a photograph from inside a an Orthodox synagogue during a ceremony. Of course, this was a wedding, so it wouldn't have been a holiday or Shabbat. But you see here the wedding of um, H. Lou Zuckerman and Sadie Bell Goldberg, which took place at the Olive Street Shul on February 28, 1909. And given, again, the lay-led nature of this community, the officiating rabbi was actually Isidore Myers of Sinai Temple. Getting a little feedback again, if you don't mind muting. Okay, so here's the second building of Sinai Temple. Sinai Temple itself was chartered in 1906 as the first conservative synagogue in Southern California. The first building was at 1153 Valencia Street, which currently houses the Pico Union Project. If you're familiar with that project, it's a multi-faith cultural arts center and house of worship. And it's, I don't know how it's being used specifically now as we're still, I suppose, in the pandemic mode, but it was for a time a vibrant interreligious community there. In 1925, the rapidly growing congregation actually moved to this building. This is the second building, as I mentioned, pictured here on the corner of 4th Street and New Hampshire Avenue in the Wilshire district. The third and current building, in case you're curious, was constructed in 1960. And of course, that's at 10400 Wilshire Boulevard. This is another one of our historic photos. You see here the groundbreaking for Sinai Temple during the this was February, during February of 1925. I think February 15th, but don't hold me to that. Nevertheless, this was the second building, as I mentioned, at 4th Street and New Hampshire. And this gentleman here in the light-colored coat in the middle was a very important figure in Los Angeles and certainly at Sinai Temple as well. You may know the name Benjamin Platt. He was the proprietor of the Platt Music Company, which had a very illustrious history in the city. And he also, Benjamin Platt, was the longest serving president of Sinai Temple, serving from 1930 to 1951. Again, that's the groundbreaking. So, another little snapshot from this period is this business card. This is for a Dr. Sanford Zuckerman. Now, Zuckerman was actually a woman, and you don't get that from this card because in those days, as I'm sure you know, not only did women almost always, take their husband's last name, but also their first name. So part of the confusion sometimes when we're doing historical research is it ain't necessarily so that this was Sanford himself. This was actually his wife. And one of the bits of information that we've uncovered is that during the 19th and 20th century, in the early 20th century, a substantial number of these chiropodists or chiropodists, which is what we now call podiatrists, were women, in fact. And you can see that here she is with her location at the Imperial Hair Bazaar, which was operated by Frank Neubauer. She's listed, Zuckerman, in the Los Angeles City Directory as Miss Sanford Zuckerman. So there you go. Here's another individual from this period, Jacob Stern. He was born near Coburg, Germany, where my family comes from. as well. I mean, that's not why he's significant. I'm just throwing that in. Nevertheless, but Jacob Stern spent time in New York City, in Cleveland, Ohio, before joining his cousin Joseph Goodman in 1889 in a Fullerton, California merchandise business. Stern and Goodman Mercantile grew into 5 Southern California stores and was one of the state's first chain stores, actually. And in 1904, Jacob moved his family to Hollywood and entered the real estate business, with his office actually located downtown in Los Angeles in the Pacific Electric Building on Main Street. Joseph Stern was married to Sarah Leventhal. Also very interesting history. They were married in 1891, and Sarah's father, Elias Leventhal, was among the founding members of the Hebrew Benevolent Society in Los Angeles, which was established in 1854. So coming from a pioneer Jewish family. Prior to marriage, Sarah graduated from the city's normal school. I don't know if you're familiar with the normal schools of that period, but that was essentially a teaching training institute, a college for teachers. And interestingly, the California branch, or I should say the Los Angeles branch of the California State Normal School, where she attended, opened in 1882, and in 1919, it actually became UCLA. So a little trivia about UCLA as well. She taught for a time in Coronado before marriage. Now this is the Stern residence, pictured in 1912. This is when Jacob Stern leased the property to the movie industry. But this was a 5-acre property bounded by Hollywood Boulevard, Vine Street, Selma Avenue, and Ivar Street. And this lot was actually acquired from a colorful character named Colonel. Of course, in those days, Colonel was an honorific given to people of substance, as it were, men of substance. Colonel Robert Northam, who was a wealthy inventor and manufacturer. And this home was described as one of the most beautiful showplaces of Hollywood. So now we're getting into early Hollywood, and that's significant because, as I mentioned, this became sort of a de facto movie studio as well. So in 1912, Jacob Stern leased the 2-acre property, or 2 acres of his property, to the Lasky Feature Play Company, which would eventually become Paramount Pictures. And in 1913, Cecil B. DeMille, Samuel Goldwyn, and Jesse Lasky made Hollywood's first feature-length film, The Squaw Man, at the barn on Stern's property. And this is a placard attesting to that. Moving on, another place that I'm sure you're aware of, you've heard of it, maybe you've been there, the Breed Street Shul. So the site for Congregation Talmud Torah, better known as the Breed Street Shul, was purchased in 1915. The Orthodox congregation was originally a wood-framed school building and small synagogue at 247 North Breed Street. The present building, which was completed in 1923, was in fact the centerpiece of the Jewish community of Boyle Heights and nearby City Terrace through the 1950s. Now, of course, we could do a whole session on Boyle Heights, and some of you may have some roots out there as well. That would be wonderful. But I just want to mention that Breed Street Shul is part of a larger kind of restructuring, rehabilitation project called the Breed Street Shul project. And this is headed in part by the Jewish Historical Society of Southern California. And I just want to read a little bit, just give a little plug for the project itself. The Breed Street Shul project's mission is to bring together the Jewish, Latino, and other communities of Los Angeles by rehabilitating the landmark Breed Street Shul in Boyle Heights, transforming it into a center of arts, culture, education, and service for its current neighbors, and making it a place of learning, teaching, and wonder for all. The nonprofit Breed Street Shul project was established in 1999 to rehabilitate the Breed Street Shul and develop uses that meet the needs of the current neighbors. So I don't know what the status is, to be honest, at the present. I know it's a long-term project of rehabilitation, but it is nice that this building has been preserved, and at some point might be worth a visit. Now, I just want to conclude my slides. I have several more slides, but I want to share two stories from this period. As I mentioned, I'm a cantor. I'm a music historian primarily. So the history of the music in early Los Angeles, or during these years, if we want to call it early Los Angeles, is near and dear to me. And one of those figures has a wonderful name, Abraham Frankenstein. Here he is grinning. Frankenstein, by the way, it's a little side note to this story. He had two sons, and they both, for whatever reason, you can tell me, chose to not keep their last name Frankenstein and go by their middle names. So just first and middle name instead. Actually, that was, of course, the result of the popularity of the Frankenstein movie franchise, which began in the 1930s and had, several movies through Universal, etc. But it is of note that Frankenstein is sometimes a Jewish name, and there has been some discussion about the possible Jewish roots of Mary Shelley's story. Did she borrow from the golem, etc., etc. But that's neither here nor there. You can look it up. It's an interesting bit of deep diving, if you wish. So Abraham Frankenstein was born in Chicago in 1873. And by the age of 15, he was playing violin at concerts in Chicago through the West Chicago Park Commission. He later was in the Illinois National Guard Band and was put in charge of the string section for them. And then in 1893, at the young age of 20, he was appointed music director of the Lyceum Theater in Memphis, part of the vaudeville circuit in those days. And he spent the 1896-1897 season as first violinist and concertmaster with the Grau Opera Company, and the 1897-98 season with the Calhoun Opera Company. Now, this is important because these involvements brought him to Los Angeles. He actually first visited the West Coast in January of 1897 with the Grau Opera Company, and had a 2-week engagement at the Los Angeles Theater, later called the Lyceum Theater, on Spring Street. And then he got hired at the Orpheum Theater in Los Angeles. This was the original site, founded in 1888. If you know anything about the current Orpheum Theater, perhaps you've been there. That building on South Broadway was constructed in 1926. Anyway, in 1898, he became the music director of the Orpheum Theater on South Main Street in Los Angeles. And he, that is Abraham Frankenstein, has the claim to fame that he was the first permanent music director at a Los Angeles theater, again, during these vaudeville days. And he would stay there at the Orpheum for 30 years. Here's the interior of the Orpheum Theater. I'm not sure exactly the provenance of this particular photograph. I do think or image, I should say. This is a postcard. I think it's the original site. I'm not 100% positive, but you get a sense of what these theaters were like. Very ornate, very gaudy, certainly uh, destinations. I wish they still made theaters like this today, although, of course, the style is out of date. It's just so remarkable. This is Los Angeles, theaters like this. You could still visit the theater district today. As I mentioned, the Orpheum Theater and several others are still there if you want a taste of yesteryears, as it were. But the Orpheum Theater did attract, as most of these vaudeville places did, the biggest names in vaudeville and popular entertainment in those days, people like Jack Benny and Fanny Brice and Harry Houdini and the Marx Brothers and Sophie Tucker, etc. And in fact, Charlie Chaplin and Charlie Murray used to sit behind Frankenstein as Frankenstein was directing the pit orchestra, and they would chat in between acts during these performances. Now, that tells us something about Frankenstein. He was very gregarious. He was very well liked by the performers, by the vaudeville stage performers. His musicians, though, those under his baton, had kind of a different experience of him. He was known to be a taskmaster, and in fact, he would often launch into tirades and fire musicians left and right. And he would be asked by the press, why did you fire so and so? Why is the trumpeter no longer in the group, etc.? And he would always say, well, that guy was an SOB. That was kind of his catchphrase. So a number of these musicians formed their own band, and guess what they called it? The SOBs. And they were an LA band for a little while too. So just a funny little story. Now, the reason why Frankenstein is still important, if you consider this to be important, is because in 1913, he wrote the music for I Love You, California, with lyricist F.B. Silverwood, who had Silverwood's men's clothing store, if you're familiar with that. But together, they wrote I Love You, California, which in 1951, commemorating the centennial of the state of California, became the state song. So you probably didn't know that California had a state song. And if you did know it had a state song, maybe you thought it did. I don't know if you knew that this was the one. But we're going to hear a little bit of I Love You, California.
Greatest state of all. I love you in the winter, summer, spring, and in the fall. I love your fertile valleys, your dear mountains I adore. I love your grand old ocean, and I love her rugged shore. Where the snow-crowned golden Sierras keep their watch while the valleys bloom. It is there I would be, in a land by the sea, every breeze bearing rich perfume. It is here next the hills of Herreras, it is home, sweet home to me, and I know when I die, I shall breathe my last sigh for my sunny California.
Believe it or not, we're only maybe a third of the way through that song. It goes on and on, but you get the idea. And in fact, I Love You, California wasn't written to be the state song. As I mentioned, it became the state song in 1951. But it was part of a larger project in Southern California in those days to basically write promotional music that would attract visitors, but more specifically attract people to move west to settle in California. So they presented a very saccharine, very kind of romantic vision of California as a place of orange groves and haciendas and so forth and so on. Um, that was part of a larger city boosterism of those days. There are a lot of songs like this, is what I'm trying to say. All right, now here's another individual, Walter Henry Rothwell. Rothwell was actually born Rothschild, and I'm not sure, I haven't been able to locate whether or not he was part of that large extended banking family. But nevertheless, he was born in London in 1872 to Bertha Lowenberg of Hohenems, Austria, in the Rhine Valley region of Austria, and Barnett Robert Rothschild of Dover, England. Now, this gentleman, as you'll see, is very important in LA history, but I'm going to just give you some biographical details first. He was a musically gifted child. He entered the State Academy of Vienna at the age of 9, if you can believe it, and actually graduated at age 15 with the highest honors, studying piano and composition. He would continue his studies in Vienna and Munich, and despite his youth, became a vocal coach with the Vienna Court Opera, and eventually got hooked up with Gustav Mahler, who at that time was the assistant conductor at the Hamburg State Opera. Rothberg left Hamburg after just 2 years to pursue first conductor duties in various European cities. So it was in the early 20th century, 1904 to 1905, that Rothwell first got a taste of America, as it were. He did 114, I believe, American performances of Wagner's Parsifal, which in those days was part of a trend to do European operas in English. These were English opera companies. Purists would say that's an abomination, to have something with French or German text, Italian text, to do that in English. But I think, there may be an appetite for that these days. That's just an aside. But nevertheless, in 1904, 1905, he did these performances in America, fell in love with America, and took a position as the principal conductor of the St. Paul Symphony Orchestra in 1908. That orchestra folded in 1915, and Rothwell then was in New York working as a freelance teacher and guest conductor. And that's when things get interesting, because it was in New York that he was scouted to be the first conductor of the nascent Los Angeles Philharmonic, which had its debut in 1919. So a little bit of history on the Philharmonic. There had been a couple, that is 2 orchestras that were performing regularly in Los Angeles prior to 1919. One was the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra, which was kind of semi-professional. They would do maybe 6 to 8 performances a year. Not anything to write home about, according to contemporary reports, but, a consistent orchestra. The other one was the Women's Orchestra. Los Angeles actually had a women's symphony, which had to be amateur in those days. Women couldn't get paid to do this, but this was like women from a more, a higher class, so to speak, upper socioeconomic class, who were hobbyists, and they had an orchestra called the Women's Symphony. So this was part of the kind of reputation that Los Angeles had at that time. They weren't quite in the same league as San Francisco. San Francisco looked down on Los Angeles, I mentioned that earlier, as a cultural wasteland in these days. The emerging Hollywood was seen as certainly a lesser form of art, that kind of thing. And so there was some energy around getting a professional orchestra in Los Angeles. And that came with some money as well. William Clark Jr., who was an amateur violinist and the son of a Montana copper baron, pledged a gift of $200,000 to establish the Philharmonic, which in those days, I think inflation would say that was about $3 million, something like that. And then he also pledged another $150,000, about $2 million annually for about 5 years, the first 5 years of the orchestra. And William Clark, wanted to hire Sergei Rachmaninoff, actually, to be the founding conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Rothwell was something of a second choice, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And you can see Rothwell, sorry, there he is, but standing here next to the soloist at the first concert. Now, what's interesting is music critic Edwin Schallert, who is from San Francisco. He wrote for the, he was the Los Angeles critic, rather. He wrote this: convincingly proving his ability to weld into shape a new organization and his capacity for realizing both the musical and artistic content of the program, Walter Henry Rothwell, as conductor of the Philharmonic Orchestra, yesterday startled Los Angeles out of her symphonic slumbers and introduced what might be termed a new epoch in local musical history. And this was from the Los Angeles Times in October 25th, 1919. Bruno David Usher, who is the music critic for the Pacific Coast Musical Review, which was up in San Francisco, he constantly in that paper ridiculed Los Angeles, but he had a change of heart in October 4th, 1919, when he wrote that because of Rothwell and the Los Angeles Philharmonic, this city of Los Angeles would be transformed from a city haphazard into a city beautiful. And I think that's what happened. Really, this was the beginning of Los Angeles being this cultural center of America and perhaps the world. I just want to play a little bit of this. It's very rare to find recordings of the Los Angeles Philharmonic during these days. Rothwell didn't record much with the orchestra. He preferred radio. There was a standard oil radio hour in LA, and they would perform quite often on that. But I did find a recording of Lohengrin Prelude from Richard Wagner from 1920. You know, not a great recording, but gives you a sense of the quality of the orchestra. And I'm just so excited that this even exists that I want to share it with you. Unfortunately, it's Wagner, but what are you going to do, right? So that recording from the very early days of the Los Angeles Philharmonic really charted like I said, a new course. Shortly thereafter, Los Angeles would become the entertainment capital of the world as we know it today. This is a commemorative coin. Um, and I think what's interesting too is we come to the end of the 1920s, as the 1920s move along, we'll have the emergence of sound film with, uh, the jazz singer. We could talk all day about that as well, and various other early projects. And that really did signal a real major shift in terms of not only Hollywood, but Los Angeles generally, the development of the city, the growth of the Jewish population that came with that as well, the rise of prominence of a number of Jews in Hollywood and elsewhere during the 1930s and 40s and 50s, which again could be part 3 if you're interested. But those are the stories that I have for today. So again, if you have questions, comments, I'm happy to discuss with you. Not that I have answers to everything, but I like questions even if I don't have the answers. Yes. The Hertzes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Prior to my retirement, I had a 5th floor office on Chateau Avenue, which is very close to New Hampshire. And I would look down and I had 2 views of the Islamic Center Little Day School, where the boys and girls would play at separate times, and the view of the early Sinai Synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't figure out what it was because I knew it wasn't a synagogue, but it still had our Jewish stained glass windows. And it's now a Korean American church.
Right.
And it was like, oh my goodness, this is a piece of history. And I could look at it every day.
Yeah, that's really neat. And that trend of houses of worship changing hands in that way, that's obviously not unique to Los Angeles. I think it's a good thing. I actually had, this is a complete aside, but I think it's good when that happens, when the next community comes in, retains the stained glass, as you're saying, kind of keeps that history. I actually had a cousin who was living in Monterey in a abandoned church, and it was similar. In her room there was a stained glass from the church and that kind of thing. So I do think it's nice that people tend to treat religious centers with that kind of respect. Maybe there's some taboo or superstition around changing it or whatever it might be, but this is just an observation I've made in the past few days. When you look at what's going on in Ukraine and the devastation of these cities, often you'll see the only remaining building will be the church in the center of the town. So anyway, that's just an observation, but you're reminding me of that. Yes, I
Yeah.
think Lorraine, maybe you were first.
So in 1961, I think it was, I worked at the Hollywood Paramount Theater, which is now the El Capitan. And that had been a live theater previously, because although we didn't use those back rooms, there were dressing rooms and stuff behind the stage. But when you showed the picture of the Orpheum, I thought of the Pantages.
Yeah.
Because when you go into the Pantages, it's that same ornateness and the boxes along the sides and stuff like that.
Yeah, there are a number of theaters still remaining, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that happened with vaudeville as it kind of declined in the let's say the 1920s and certainly into the 30s was the transformation of vaudeville theaters into movie palaces, as they were called. So a lot of these would continue to have stage programs, and in vaudeville, when it was more of the variety show, they would use short films, silent films as kind of a buffer between things. So if you get there early, you'll watch a little film, or they'd play a movie as people were leaving the theater. But ultimately, when feature-length films came around, and then certainly when sound film came around, they transformed these into palaces. So your observation is correct. The idea of keeping some of the old days, even as it's primarily used for something else these days, and kind of a multi-purpose aesthetic, as it were.
As a matter of fact, up in the balcony, they had couches. I mean,
Yeah.
like seats, double seats, which ultimately had to be torn out because of what was going on upstairs in the balconies. We were, as ushers, nobody wanted to go upstairs to the balcony, because
Yeah, I
stuff was
understand.
going on up there.
Yeah, I was at the El Capitan once, up in the balcony to see a movie there, but I don't remember the couches. So they must have been removed a long time ago.
They were probably removed. Well, they were there in 61. So they were probably removed, but they weren't there when I stopped working there. So I think probably sometime in the early 60s they were removed.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a great story.
That's funny.
Yes.
Rosalie.
Yes, there you are.
Yeah, I remember taking the streetcars in LA, and they were very comfortable. And I'm passing by all the theaters on Broadway. The streetcars, they were replaced eventually by buses, which I didn't like very much because they were gas guzzlers. But anyway, the streetcars were very comfortable. And I remember passing by a multitude of theaters, even movie theaters. And I remember going into one and watching El Cid, which really goes back, was it 1960 or so. And the seating was just beautiful. And there were so many theaters on Broadway. And I also passed department stores. There was a Broadway, Bullock's, Robinson's, May Company. And I'm wondering, were these founded by Jewish people? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, Robinson's, that's a Jewish name. But I'm just wondering if this is something that you'll cover, the founding of department stores.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we could definitely take a deep dive down a rabbit hole on that one. I mean, May himself was Jewish, so the May Company. In fact, I mentioned Benjamin Platt during the Depression. I think it was when his company was in some financial trouble, as many were in those days. He actually moved his business into the Los Angeles May Company building. They sold pianos and other things through there. That being said, yeah, absolutely. The history of department stores, growing out of the peddler merchant kind of, push cart into these department stores, that happened in the West, that happened in New York. And one of the interesting outcomes of that too, and something I find very fascinating, is that at those department stores was also the beginning of what was called the Christmas effect, meaning that these stores would decorate themselves for Christmas.
They
Way
would.
back into the the late 19th century, they were pioneering this idea of dressing up the store, bringing in clients specifically for the Christmas holiday. Santa Claus is here, all of that kind of stuff. So I think it's important for me to keep that in mind when I'm going shopping during the Christmas season. And sometimes it can be very nauseating, all of that stuff. But just remember that there were Jews behind that,
Yeah,
as,
that's right.
as there were behind most of those songs and everything else. So
Yeah.
like we have a place even there. But the phenomenon you're addressing is really fascinating. One other thing that I'm thinking, and I know I'm just kind of stream of consciousness here, but you can find on YouTube some footage of early Christmas parades in New York, where it was before these songs became so popular, Irving Berlin's White Christmas, etc., and all of the imagery that came with those songs. And if you look at those Christmas parades, they almost look like Halloween parades. They're very creepy. The music that they're playing is very strange. It's like, ghouls walking down the street. So, part of that is just recognizing the positive impact of Jewish contributors on that season. It could be worse, I guess is what I'm saying. But yeah, all of that came out of the department store and trying to sell things and build up that holiday, etc.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I remember
Yeah.
going to Nordstrom's shoe store on 7th Street. It is amazing that grew into a department store. So,
Yeah, did they do the X-rays in those days so you could see your foot inside the shoe and all of that stuff? I've heard stories
pretty,
about this.
pretty fancy, yeah.
Yeah, doesn't sound that safe though, the X-ray thing. A lot of radiation floating around the shoe store. Dennis.
Yes, this is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. You mentioned that there were 40,000 Jews in Los Angeles by 1920, and I didn't catch additional background about that. That seems like an astonishing number.
Yeah.
Which I never would have guessed. And I guess you talked a little bit about where they came from, but any other comment about why so many? And
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of that was, just the move westward generally, that the country was experiencing. Most of those Jews who came were Midwestern or, from New York, East Coast, going to the Midwest, then going to LA. So these weren't necessarily like, what do they call them? Greenhorns, but there were a number of more traditional Jews who would come at that time too. So part of the development of Jewish institutions at that time was a result of there being more Jews who wanted to do Jewish things specifically. I think last time we talked about a more individualistic approach for the earlier migrants, but it's just kind of a side effect, as it were, of the larger migration to the city. As the city grew, the Jewish population grew along with it. And yeah, coming down from San Francisco as well, as I mentioned. But yeah, it is a remarkable growth. Hollywood too, though, played a huge role in that, as did, just economic opportunities. I think when we think about Jewish migration patterns, whether it's in Europe or the United States or elsewhere, just follow the money. I mean, I don't want that to sound devious in any way. It's just, economic migration for the most part. And there were a lot of opportunities in the West.
I just had one other comment. You mentioned William Andrews Clark, and
Yeah.
he's quite a figure on the USC campus. There's you probably know this, I'm sure. There's Clark House, which was for many years the main center for faculty, music faculty lessons and offices and things like that. And then I guess the same Clark for the Clark Library, I guess, right?
I think so, yeah.
At UCLA.
He was a great lover of music, an amateur violinist, but from a very wealthy family and a patron. Really not an unsung hero, because as you mentioned, all of these buildings have his name, but I think not well known enough in terms of the kind of classical music world in Los Angeles. What's interesting about that is I wrote a chapter in a book on Walter Henry Rothwell, the first conductor. There really wasn't there was no biography really of him before that. There were little snippets. We think about the later conductors, Bruno Walter and other kind of known figures who would have the baton in Los Angeles. But, Rothwell, for whatever reason, had been forgotten. And I think along with him, a lot of those early figures like Clark it's just so long ago now, I think, is part of it.
Well, just one other comment. I don't know if you're familiar with a book. It was written in the 1970s called We Build a School of Music. It was written by Pauline Alderman, who was a professor at USC starting in the 1930s. And she covers a lot of the same people. Most of them are not Jewish, but Clark and others. And it's a very interesting history of music in Los Angeles, which of course had something to do with Jews in Los Angeles.
Oh, absolutely. And when
Yeah.
you look at the place of particularly Los Angeles Community College in the musical development of the city, I mean, that's another overlooked reality that was the main
Oh.
music program before UCLA and before USC. I mean, there's a lot there, and it's mostly forgotten, as I think we're both alluding to. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if the Philharmonic Auditorium is still in LA. I haven't passed by there in a long time, but I used to usher there, as a
Oh, really?
teenager. And I remember the Bolshoi coming. So it wasn't just a
Yeah.
Philharmonic. They had a lot of different groups coming and performing. And then, of course, they moved to the Music Center when that was built. But I wonder if if the Philharmonic Auditorium is still in existence, or did they tear it down?
I my instinct is to say that it is not, but I'm not sure. I know when it was built, it was the biggest building of its kind, whatever the kind was.
Yeah, it's just up the street from the Biltmore. The Biltmore is still there.
Yeah.
But I don't know about Philharmonic Auditorium. I'm just curious. I'll
Yeah,
check it out.
I'd have to look into that. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Tony.
We have both your book and we're longtime subscribers to the journal. So if people would like to look at it as a preview to subscribing, just let me know. Mark can bring it on a hike, or if some of you are here, or if we're at Temple or wherever we are, we'd be glad to let you preview it.
I
And the
appreciate
journal
that.
is fascinating because you just don't know all these stories about, I call them the Jewish cowboys, because
Yeah.
they really settled the West with mercantile places that I had no idea until we started subscribing. So
Yeah. And actually, as a follow-up to that, in one of our upcoming issues, I did an article on the Frisco Kid, the movie, which some of you probably know, maybe all of you, and looking at the historical foundation for the stories, the vignettes, both in the film and also in the screenplay. There were a lot of scenes that weren't shot for the movie where Avram the rabbi encounters various Jews along the way as he's traveling westward, which just didn't make it into the movie, unfortunately. But the screenwriters were subscribers to the journal. So a lot of what made it into the movie and didn't, as I mentioned, the original screenplay had a lot more of it, were stories like directly taken from the journal. So it's a really fun article. Again, if you subscribe, you'll get that as well. But yeah, we're having a lot of fun being kind of at a period of retrospection, even with the journal, and looking at the influence of the journal, 50 years plus later, and what kind of impact has it had on the culture. And it's kind of fun to look at things like The Frisco Kid, which is a movie that I've long loved myself.
Yes, I have a question. I have a copy of Forsman and Gardner's History of the Jews of Los Angeles, and it stops around 1970, which is 50 years ago. Is there a more up-to-date history of the Jews of Los Angeles?
What a wonderful question. Yeah, that book was published in 1970, so yeah, obviously it can't go beyond that. My recollection is that Forsman actually wrote a kind of a supplementary article, a lengthy article for the Encyclopedia Judaica that goes a little bit beyond, but again, it's still kind of not totally up to date because it was published years ago. Also, there hasn't really been an attempt, I don't even think, to try to do that kind of a history book. I do think that there's probably a need for it. Part of the issue, I think, is that that book is kind of intimidating from a certain perspective. There's so much in it, and so much that they had access to that's kind of lost to the ages. That I think the next volume would have to be like 1970 to whatever, 2020 or something like that. Like rehashing those early days would be very difficult now. But yeah, I think a part two would be in order of, I don't know, not looking at myself to do it, but I think it would be a great project for sure. I've had the same thoughts about that, something as comprehensive, but the next period would be wonderful.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Our program committee is meeting on Monday, and people will discuss if there's any more on Jewish history of LA we might want to hear about in the future. We have so many things going on. I'm glad we could have 2 sessions with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. It was excellent presentation.